There is a moment in every person's life when they realize the thing they thought was protecting them has a crack in it. Not because it was weak, but because someone, somewhere, handed them an incomplete version of it. And they carried that incomplete version faithfully, desperately for years, wondering why it wasn't working the way it was supposed to. I want to talk to you about that today. Because what I am about to show you is not a new idea. It is not a modern interpretation. It is something that was written thousands of years ago, buried in a language most people never get access to, and passed down through a tradition that guarded it carefully. Because the people who understood it knew that if the wrong translation became the only translation, something irreplaceable would be lost. That is exactly what happened. And the price of that loss is not abstract. It shows up in your life. In the gap between what you pray for and what you actually feel. In the distance between the words you speak out loud and the silence that follows them. In the exhaustion of someone who has done everything right and still feels like they are falling. I have spent years sitting with people in that silence. And again, the same thing is true. They are not lacking faith, they are lacking the original text. Let me show you what I mean. Most people who know Psalm 91 have encountered it the way it was translated in the 16th and 17th centuries. Beautiful language, elevated, poetic, resonant, and on the surface it reads like a promise, a shelter, a place of refuge. He who dwells in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. Stunning words, words that have brought people to their knees for centuries. But the Hebrew does something the translation does not fully carry across. The opening word in Psalm 91 is not a description. It is not an invitation. It is a condition. In Hebrew, the psalm opens with a word that carries the weight of a legal clause, something closer to whoever is actively, continuously, presently dwelling, not whoever once found shelter, not whoever believes shelter exists, whoever is in the act right now of inhabiting that secret place. This matters enormously, because the promise that follows, the protection, the covering, the shield, is not offered to someone who knows about the shelter intellectually. It is activated only for the one who is actually inside it. The Hebrew makes this distinction with almost brutal clarity. Most translations smooth this over. They flatten the condition into comfort. And when you remove the condition, the promise starts to feel like a guarantee regardless of your position, which sounds kind, but it is actually a form of spiritual disservice. Because when the protection does not seem to be working in your life, you have no way of asking the right question. You only know that something is not connecting, you do not know why. The why is the condition. Are you dwelling, not visiting, not remembering fondly, not referencing in moments of crisis? Are you continuously actively inhabiting the awareness of that presence? That is what the Hebrew is asking, and that is the question that changes everything. Now let me take you deeper, because this is where it gets extraordinary. In verse 4, the psalm says that God will cover you with feathers, that under the divine wings you will find refuge. In English, this reads as a beautiful metaphor, tender, maternal almost, the image of a mother bird sheltering her young. And it is beautiful. I am not dismissing it. But the Hebrew word used for the covering here, sukkah, is a word with a very specific ancient resonance. It is the same root used in the festival of Sukkot, where the Jewish people build temporary structures and live inside them for 7 days, specifically to remember that their ancestors lived in incomplete, fragile shelters during 40 years of wandering. The sukkah is not a permanent structure, it is deliberately impermanent. And that is the whole theological point. When the psalm says God will cover you with sukkah, it is not promising you a fortress. It is promising you something more intimate and more demanding than a fortress. It is saying that in the most exposed, most fragile, most transient moments of your existence, in the moments when your circumstances offer you no stable structure at all, the covering is still there, not in spite of the fragility through it. This is what gets lost in the translation. The word sukkah carries an entire theology of sacred vulnerability. You are not protected because you have built something unbreakable. You are protected because the presence itself becomes the shelter when everything else is incomplete. If you have ever been in a season where everything felt temporary and uncertain, where you could not point to any stable structure in your life and say, "That is holding me up," this verse was written for that moment. not for the moment after you find solid ground, for the moment when the ground is not solid, when the sukkah is all you have. That is when the covering activates. Let me give you something personal now. I want to tell you about a woman, I will call her Miriam, who sat across from me during one of the most devastating periods of her life. She had lost her marriage, her home, and her sense of identity within the span of about 14 months. She was not dramatic about it. She was quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when a person has been in shock for so long they have forgotten what it felt like to be otherwise. She said to me, "I have read Psalm 91 every single day for the last year. Every day. And I feel like I am standing outside a door that should be open to me, and it is just not opening." I asked her what she thought the psalm was promising her. She said safety, that nothing would harm me. And I said, let me show you what the word harm means in the original. Because in verse 10, the psalm says that no evil will befall you, no plague will come near your dwelling. In English, this sounds like a promise of external protection, that bad things will be kept away from you. And again, this is not wrong. But the Hebrew word for evil here, ra'ah, carries a much more specific meaning in its ancient context. It refers not just to catastrophic external events, but to the kind of evil that corrupts the character, the evil that enters through bitterness, through despair, through the slow erosion of trust. The thing the ancient writers feared most was not disaster. It was the spiritual deformation that disaster could cause if you moved through it without the covenant. The promise is not only that circumstances will not destroy you, it is that the process of walking through hard circumstances will not destroy who you are. That your integrity, your spirit, your sense of being held, these will remain intact even when everything around them collapses. When I explained this to Miriam, something changed in her face. Not because her circumstances had changed, because the frame had changed. She was not standing outside a locked door waiting to be admitted to safety. She was already inside the only shelter that mattered, and she had not recognized it because she was looking for solid walls and finding feathers. Feathers, not walls. That is the promise. And this brings me to something that I think is the most important single word in Psalm 91. A word that appears toward the end of the psalm and is routinely translated in a way that costs the reader almost everything. The Hebrew word is yeda'eni. It comes from the root yada, to know. And in the ancient Hebrew understanding, to know is not a cognitive act. It is a relational one. The same word is used to describe the most intimate bond between two people. When the text says, God will know you, protect you, because you have known God, the word is not referring to information. It is referring to the kind of relational knowing that changes both parties. The knowing of a covenant. The knowing of a witness who has seen everything and stayed anyway. This is what the psalm is built on. Not intellectual acknowledgement of a divine concept, not recitation of a text as a spiritual habit, a relational knowing, a two-way recognition. And the extraordinary claim buried in that word is this: the protection of Psalm 91 flows through the relationship, not around it. You cannot use this psalm the way you use a talisman. You cannot carry it the way you carry a lucky object. It is not a tool. It is a covenant. And a covenant by definition requires both parties to be in it. If this teaching is resonating with something deep in you, if you feel like you have been holding an incomplete version of something that was meant to be complete, I want to give you a framework for how to actually use this understanding starting today. Not as a ritual that you perform and then set aside. As a living practice that rewires the way you move through the most difficult terrain of your life. Here is what the rabbinical tradition teaches about this psalm specifically. It was recited at the transition points of danger, not only in moments of crisis but as preparation before entering territory that was uncertain. Soldiers recited it, travelers recited it, healers who worked among the sick recited it. But they recited it differently than we often do now. They recited it as a declaration of position. I am in the secret place, I am dwelling. I am actively inside the covenant. And from this position, everything the psalm promises is already operative. The recitation was not a request for the protection to begin. It was an announcement that the condition had been met. That distinction between asking and announcing is the difference between the translation and the original. between a prayer you hope will work and a covenant you declare is already working. Before I give you the second part of this teaching, I want to ask you something, and I want you to sit with it honestly, not quickly. When you have read or prayed or recited these ancient words in the past, and were you asking, or were you dwelling? Because the answer to that question is the beginning of everything that comes next. If what you just heard shifted something in you, if you felt even a small recognition that you have been carrying an incomplete version of something that was always meant to be complete, share this with someone who is in the middle of their own valley right now. Not as a nice gesture, because they need the complete version, because the incomplete version keeps people standing outside a door that is already open. Drop a word in the comments that describes what this teaching unlocked for you, even one word. Sometimes naming it is the first act of dwelling. Let me pick up exactly where we left off. Because the second half of what the original Hebrew reveals about Psalm 91 is, if anything, even more staggering than the first. And I want to walk through it slowly because this is the part that explains not just why the protection exists, but how it moves. We talked about the condition, the active dwelling. We talked about sukkah, the covering that activates precisely in fragility. We talked about yada, the relational knowing that is the engine of the covenant. Now I want to go to the verses that most translations have most significantly muted, because this is where the psalm stops being a comfort and becomes something closer to a war document. Verse 11. For he shall give his angels charge over you to keep you in all your ways. Beautiful, familiar, tattooed on arms and carved into monuments. But the Hebrew behind the phrase, to keep you in all your ways, is where the weight lives. The word translated as ways is derakim, from the root derek, which means not just a road, but a chosen direction. A life path selected with intention. And the word translated as keep is lishmor, which in its fullest ancient usage means not simply to guard passively, but to watch with active, engaged vigilance. The way a watchman watches, not sleeping through the night and hoping for the best. Eyes open, alert, responsive. The promise is not that angels will follow you wherever your feet happen to wander. The promise is that when you are moving in an intentional direction, when you are walking a chosen path with purpose, there is an active, engaged, watchful presence that accompanies every step. The protection is directional. It moves with your movement. It activates with your intention. This is why people who have lost their sense of direction often feel the most spiritually unprotected. Not because the covenant has withdrawn, because they have stopped moving with intention. The covering is still there, but it follows the path. And if you are not on a path, if you are circling in confusion or standing still in fear, you are not giving the covering anywhere to follow you. The ancient rabbis taught that the opening of a path is itself an act of partnership with the divine. You take one step in a chosen direction, and then the charge activates. You move first. The watching presence moves with you. This shifts everything about how you approach a moment of paralysis. The instinct in a crisis is to wait for clarity before moving, to feel protected before committing to a direction. But the psalm is structured the other way around. You commit to the direction. The protection accompanies the commitment. Clarity comes through the movement, not before it. Now let me bring you to the most ancient layer of this psalm that almost no one in modern audiences ever encounters. Because Psalm 91 has a dialogical structure that the plain reading completely obscures. In the original Hebrew, there are actually 4 distinct voices in this psalm. Not one narrator speaking about God. 4 voices. And the shift between them is written into the grammar. The first voice is a teacher or sage describing the life of the one who dwells in the secret place. Verses 1 and 2, third person. The sage is speaking about the person, not to them. Then, in verses 3 through 13, the voice shifts. Now it is a second voice, and the rabbinical commentators debate who this voice is, but the dominant tradition identifies it as the divine voice itself, speaking directly to the person who is dwelling. The shift is unmistakable in Hebrew because the pronouns change completely. I will say of the Lord becomes He will deliver you, and then it becomes I will be with him. Suddenly, in verse 14, the first person appears, and this is the voice of God speaking unmediated directly. Because he has set his love upon me, therefore I will deliver him. The Hebrew word translated as set his love is chashak, and this is a word that carries connotations of deep attachment, of the kind of longing that does not release its object. It is not a casual affection. It is not a polite belief. It is a clinging love, a desperate, tenacious, unrelenting love directed at the divine. And the response to that specific quality of love is the most concentrated cluster of promises in the entire psalm: deliverance, exaltation, an answered call, divine presence in trouble, not after trouble, in it, honor, long life, the complete demonstration of salvation. All of this, the text says, flows from one thing: not perfect behavior, not flawless observance, not a life without failure. Chashak, the tenacious, unrelenting attachment of love, the refusal to let go even when letting go would be easier. This is what the ancient community of faith understood that our translations have not fully carried forward. The most powerful spiritual protection available to a human being is not achieved through correctness. It is achieved through love that refuses to quit. If you have been in a season where you felt like you had too many failures, too much mess, too much distance between who you are and who you think a protected person is supposed to be, this is the word for you, chashak. You are not required to be perfect. You are required to be attached, tenaciously, stubbornly, even when it hurts, even when it does not seem to be working, even when the evidence of your circumstances screams at you that you have been abandoned. The clinging is the covenant. Now I want to give you something very practical, because a teaching that stays in the realm of the theoretical has not finished its work. Here is what the ancient tradition of engaging Psalm 91 actually looked like when it was practiced with full understanding. First, it was spoken aloud, not read silently. There is a principle in the wisdom literature that the spoken word carries a weight that the interior word does not, because speech requires the body to participate. When you speak, your breath moves, your throat opens, your body becomes a vessel for the meaning. The ancients understood that recitation was not merely the transmission of content. It was the activation of the body in the covenant. Second, it was spoken with what is called in the tradition full presence of the self, not the performative self, not the self that is watching itself pray and making sure it looks sincere. The actual interior self. The part of you that carries your specific fear, your specific name, your specific wound. The practice was to stand before the text, not as a student receiving information, but as a person bringing themselves entirely into the field of the promise. Your real situation, your actual desperation, your honest confusion. All of it brought into the encounter with the text. Third, and this is the step most people are never taught, after the recitation, the tradition included a period of reception. Not more speaking, not more asking, listening. Sitting inside the silence after the words with an open posture. The way you would sit if someone who loved you had just spoken something important and you wanted to absorb it before responding. 3 to 5 minutes, no agenda, no list of requests. Just the receptivity of someone who has just heard the most important thing that could be said and is letting it settle into the places that needed it most. This 3-part structure, voiced recitation, full self-presence, and receptive silence, is what distinguished the use of this psalm in the ancient world from the use that has become common today. Today we often bring Psalm 91 to the moments of crisis as a kind of emergency tool. When everything is already on fire, we reach for the words, and there is nothing wrong with that. But the original practice suggests that the most powerful engagement is not reactive. It is proactive. You build the dwelling before the storm. You establish the relationship before the darkness. You practice the condition, the active, continuous dwelling, so that when the valley comes, you are not starting from the outside. You are already inside. If you want to begin that practice tonight, here is what I would suggest. Find a quiet space, 15 minutes, speak Psalm 91 aloud from beginning to end. But as you speak it, I want you to make one internal substitution. Every time you encounter a protective promise, pause for just a breath and say internally, "This is already active." Not "I hope this will be active." Not "I believe this could be active." Already active. Because the covenant was established before you arrived. Your recitation is not a request for it to begin. It is your acknowledgement that you have met the condition. You are dwelling. You are in the secret place. And everything that follows from that condition is already in motion. Do this for 7 nights. Not because 7 is magical, because 7 nights of intentional practice begins to change the way your mind processes your circumstances. The anxiety that currently runs on the track of "I am not protected" begins, slowly, to run on a different track. One built from the original Hebrew rather than a softened translation. And this matters, because the way you interpret your experience determines what you reach for in response to it. If you believe you are unprotected, you will exhaust yourself trying to create the protection yourself. If you know you are dwelling in the shelter that was established before you were born, you can move with a completely different energy. Not passive, not naive. Clear, directed, walking the chosen path with the watchful presence accompanying every step. I want to close with the last word of Psalm 91 in the Hebrew. The psalm ends with the word Yeshuati, my salvation. But the root of that word is Yeshua, and in the ancient understanding, Yeshua is not only a rescue from danger, it is a widening. The word comes from the root that means to be in a wide open place as opposed to the narrow place of constriction. Salvation in this tradition is not just the absence of harm. It is the experience of expansion, of suddenly finding yourself in more space than you thought was available. This is what the covenant ultimately promises. Not just survival, not just rescue. Expansion. More room. The wide place. The life that is not constricted by what was arrayed against you, but opened by the faithfulness of the one who walks with you through the valley and out the other side. You were not meant to stay narrow. You were not meant to live in the constriction of incomplete translations and unmet promises. The original text is wider than that. The covenant is wider than that. And you were made for the wide place. Walk toward it. The covering moves with you. If something in this teaching broke something open for you today, something that had been closed for a long time, write a single word in the comments that names what it unlocked. Not for performance. Because naming what shifts in you is itself a form of chashak. It is the tenacious love declaring itself out loud. And the people who come after you in the comments will be helped by your word just as much as by anything I have said. Share this with one person who is in the narrow place right now. You may not know how close they are to the wide one.